Hello, everyone. My name is Susan Gaskin, and I'm here with Jon Atack. He is the Director of Projects and the Managing Editor for the Open Minds Foundation. Hello, Jon. How are you doing today?
Hi, Susan. I'm doing really well. How are you doing?
Pretty good, thank you. I'm very pleased to be able to chat with you because I know you have a lot to say. I know I have a lot to say, but I think you trump me in this department. You seem to have a lot more information. And I'm very anxious to hear what you have to say about undue influence. And the reason why I want to ask you is because, I don't know, I've been hearing this term used a lot these days. And I know I have an idea of what this means, but I can never really get a really good definition of what exactly is undue influence. So can you please enlighten us and tell us, how would you define undue influence?
I will do my very best. In the simplest terms, it's simply too much influence. It's where somebody has too much control over somebody else, more than they should have.
Okay, well, how would you say it works then?
Well, it's a concept that we get from the legal arena, and it's actually been around for hundreds of years. And it usually meant where, somebody was mentioned in a will and they were left a lot of money, and the court went, well, what did you do to get mentioned in the will? And that is undue influence, where they brought pressure to bear on somebody who was extremely unwell by this point, so that they would leave them the money. And the concept has gone a lot wider than that, so that we see people who are basically controlling other people's lives.
So I've also heard the term coercive control. Is there a difference then between undue influence and coercive control?
There is no significant difference. And again, coercive control has come along as a legal way of particularly talking about relationships between two people, where one of them is bullying and bossing around the other, and the other is forced into submission.
So what other words then can be used to describe undue influence? Because I think it sounds like perhaps bullying, is that something, or are there other terms that you would use? Yeah,
bullying is a form of undue influence, okay, and is never acceptable. Shouting at people, pushing them around. It becomes confusing because we have, as is often the case in the English language, we have so many words for the same thing. The word I usually default to is simply manipulation, which people have, they've put a bit of spin on it, because the word manipulation, it comes originally from manus, the hands, and it means that, like taking a piece of clay and molding it on a potter's wheel. That is the true meaning of the word manipulation. Well, if you apply that psychologically, then that's what's happening. But it's important to understand that it's not persuading somebody of something. It's, selling them on something. It's pushing them into doing something. There's a hidden agenda with the manipulator. We also have terms like exploitative persuasion, which is, for me, is the default scholarly term. But whenever I look it up on the internet, I find the first time I looked it up, which was about 20 years ago, there were 12 hits on the internet for exploitative persuasion. 6 of them were Margaret Singer, who came up with the term, and 6 of them were with. It's now that I'm happy to say gone past 200, but you'll find the Open Minds Foundation, the first 4 are ours, so nobody else is really using that term. We've had coercive persuasion. People who are kind of polarized in their view of this will tend to use the term brainwashing to say, which has become a meaningless term. Were you brainwashed nowadays means, did somebody talk you into something you didn't want to do? It doesn't mean you shackled down in a Chinese prison and shouted at by 7 people until you made a confession, which is what it actually means,
It sounds like it's almost been whitewashed, that term. It's kind of gone from brainwashing, they've kind of whitewashed it into be not quite what it used to mean at one time.
Exactly, and the horror is that it's still happening, that the program that was started in 1947 in communist China continues to this day, and there are over 1 million people in what are called re-education camps who are there because of their religious beliefs. Most of them are Muslims, are basically being told that's the wrong thing to believe. And so they're put through this very harsh series of processes to force them to change their minds. But that's what brainwashing is. It's sinao in the Chinese terms. And it actually is a religious term. It's been in use for 1,000 years, and it means the cleansing of the heart. And it's started out as a very positive idea and was then adopted by the Maoists and has come to mean this sinister thing. But when people want to dismiss the notion of social or personal influence, they say, oh, well, you're talking about brainwashing, you know, so that's not a scientific thing. Well, it is. It's a very scientific thing. There's a tremendous amount of social psychology, thousands of experiments supporting the idea that we can indeed influence people against their own best interests. And it's hard selling rather than soft selling. It's using tricks. It's deceiving people. That's manipulating. Brainwashing has a far more sinister feel to it. We also talk about mind control, and I'm a bit hesitant about that term. For me, brainwashing belongs to a process that was developed and designed, the process of thought struggle, in fact, as it was called by the Chinese, where you force people to be highly critical of themselves. You take away the locus of control from them so that they now do what the party wants them to do, think what the party wants them to think. So brainwashing has that sense of you're becoming a Manchurian candidate, some kind of zombie. Now, having dealt with quite literally thousands of people who've been in totalist groups that were manipulating their members, I haven't met any zombies yet. You know, I've met people who'd come to believe ideas that were harmful to them and commit antisocial acts, you know, in the belief that they were doing good. That I've met. So there's a spectrum of involvement, and as you say, manipulation is a good earthy central term for what's going on. Brainwashing has this kind of 1984 Brave New World sense about it, which I think's too much. Mind control, perhaps more so, because that is descriptive of the programs that were deliberately run. People usually these days know about the US, British, Canadian programs called MK Ultra, MK Naomi. They sometimes know about Bluebird, which was the US Navy. They don't necessarily realize that similar programs were being run in the Soviet Union. And that was what sort of kick-started it, that the American CIA were going, how are they getting to people to confess? You know, in the Stalin show trials, how are people who've devoted their lives to the USSR suddenly coming up and saying, yes, I used to swallow fish whole, or, you know, whatever. They're coming up with some crazy idea on the witness stand, and it doesn't look as if they're being beaten into it. The Cardinal Minzenki trial was central to this in the 50s, where a cardinal of the church started admitting to things that weren't possible. And then, of course, during the Korean War, there were American GIs, and particularly airmen, who would go on the radio and say, yeah, we were spraying, you know, germs all over North Korea, and we were doing things that had not happened. And that was, how can you get people to do this? So there was then a mind control program in the attempt to control people. It was a very sinister, it was a very unpleasant thing. There's a brilliant book by Alan Shefflin and a guy called Opton, called The Mind Manipulators, about, you know, the documents that have come out showing those programs were done. When you start kind of going, well, totalist groups, cult groups, you know, they're using mind control. Yeah, it's one way of looking at it, but it's kind of blanket way of looking at it. If you look at the Moonies, yes, their leader was actually in a North Korean prison camp for 3 years.
Yeah.
And so he learned the techniques. Then he ran a group called Victory Over Communism, where he used those techniques to change people's minds so they hated communism. And then he set up the Unification Church. So it's right to call that brainwashing or mind control. But as a general term to say, you know, well, this husband is using mind control on his wife, manipulation, coercive control, undue influence are safer terms. They're less emotive. They're more practical, I think. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah, definitely. And I think, but I think as the term starts getting more and more used by people, because I am hearing it more and more often, it may have its own connotations associated with it as well, and it may have to be changed into something else. Just like the Moonies, you know, and the Mormons, all these different groups. Eventually, you catch on to them, and you have your own connotation associated with Mormon. Now they've changed it to LDS. Jehovah's Witnesses call themselves now JW org, because there's negative connotations associated with it. But as you said, for now, undue influence is something that doesn't carry the same weight as brainwashing, even though it sort of encompasses all these different aspects that you were just mentioning.
Yeah, and we wanted to come away from the Open Minds Foundation. We wanted to come away from the kind of emotive battle that's going on, where you've got people who are counter this or counter that, and people are pro this or pro that.
Yeah.
Our concern is for the techniques that are being used by people and groups. And I'm not a part of the counter cult movement. I'm very much a part of the think for yourself movement. But to think for yourself, it's not just a matter of having critical skills. You need also to have social intelligence. You need to be able to relate to other people, and you need to have emotional autonomy. So you can go to other people and go, well, you know, what do you think about it? Listen to their opinions and then make your own mind up. So
it's more positive, as opposed to being against something. You're more pro, you know, empowering yourself through knowledge and opening up your mind to possibilities that you weren't really allowed to think about, because you're led down a path. You're kind of led down a path with these different groups and these different bullies that doesn't allow you to really ask the needed questions.
And that's where you know, that's where you know you're in a bad situation, that somebody's telling you what you have to think, what you must think.
If they're good at it, though, they won't make you feel that way. That's the clever thing, and that's why these groups don't realize they're in these destructive groups to begin with. I think is that they don't realize what's happening to them before it's too late.
No, and it, you know, undue influence has a before and an after. It has no during, because while you're under the influence, you don't know, and so it makes the legal situation rather difficult. But you know, you take somebody along and say, that person there, who is, you know, cleaning the floor with a toothbrush or with their tongue or what have you, that person doing that ridiculous thing there, they don't have their own will anymore. You can't complain about that. There's no legal basis to complain about that unless it breaks some law of abuse or harassment. So you can't. And when the person's come out the other side and said, I did crazy things that were really harmful to me and to the world, by the time you've realized that, it's usually way too late to do anything, because there is an undue influence law, but there's usually a statute of limitations. So by the time, also people leaving totalist authoritarian groups won't feel strong enough to fight back. So they won't feel that they can say, you know, you've done these things to me. We also live in a society where there is far too much bullying. There's far too much, you know, do as I say rather than do as I do. There's so much trickery in the world, and so much selfishness, and the promotion of selfishness, which has been, you know, the last 30, 40 years since von Hayek at the Chicago University put forward this idea there's only self-interest in the world. And our governments, our banking systems have all rushed to this thing that, well, it will incentivize everything. We'll make everything based upon how selfish people are. And so you're going, well, if that's what human nature is, then we're all psychopaths. And that's not my experience of life. I've met people who cared about other people. You know, I've heard about people who would go into a burning building to save somebody they've never met. So this idea of selfishness being the one element of human life, it's gone through our schools, it's gone everywhere. So that, you know, Adam Smith, the economist, talked about enlightened self-interest. Well, it's not in the least bit enlightened. It's psychopathic self-interest, so that people feel that it's all right to use hard selling tricks and public relation tricks to deceive look where the politicians are. Since the spin doctors said, hey, here we are, we're the guys that are telling them what to say, people say, well, you can't really trust anybody, can you, anymore? Because
yeah, sorry.
they've hidden behind that shield. Yeah, please, go ahead.
Well, no, I was just thinking that that's what some of these groups do, is that they make you look at everybody outside of the group as if they are selfish. You are loving, but everyone outside is selfish. So you almost dehumanize everybody else. And then you view them as, well, whatever your beliefs are. If you're part of an organization that is destructive and you believe that maybe God is going to wipe out all these people, that's your way of justifying, well, they're horrible, selfish individuals anyways, deserving of death. And so it does, it just creates exactly what you were just describing, this attitude that everybody is selfish and, they're not deserving of life even.
Yeah, and as you say, people are dehumanized, they're demonized. So, I mean, one of the ways of telling that a group is really dangerous is when it starts telling you, we are the only ones. Nobody else is really human. We saw that with anthropologists in the early 20th century trying to convince us that black people were a separate race. And we still use the word racist. Well, there are no, those races are part of a single species. Even the word genocide has built into it, and it's a modern word coming from the 40s to describe the Nazis. But it's the idea that the Jews were of a different genus.
Oh.
So it's in fact,
I didn't even know that.
Continuing the Aryan race theory. We're all, all non-Africans are descended from about 100 people who crossed over into Arabia about 70,000 years ago. We have the evidence now. We all come from the so-called mitochondrial Eve, who lived about 238,000 years ago. This one woman, we're all part of, as they sing, we are family. I have all my sisters and indeed my brothers with me. But we're part of a huge family. And these ideas of, well, I'm a Hutu, you're a Tutsi. I'm a Khmer, you're a Cambodian. All of these divisions are false. And groups that then say, well, we're the elite. We have the answers. We know how to live properly. That's probably okay. But when they say, you're inferior, you don't deserve proper treatment or rights, then everything's gone wrong. And that's an undue influence that runs throughout history, that our history is a history of tyranny. It's a history of despots, of thugs and tyrants. And since the Renaissance, of people with money who were able to influence profoundly the events of the world. And what we're moving towards, hopefully, is a democracy where people have equal rights, equal opportunities, and a chance to put their point of view forward. Where people, a massive effect of undue influence is where people don't really have the right to speak out. They don't have the right to doubt. And for me, that's the fundamental human right to put your hand up and say, hang on a minute, I didn't understand what you were saying. You're suggesting that we should kill all the people who have, two arms, or we should, or have red hair. That's been a recent one, hasn't it? Gingers, this thing of defining some aspect of the, they've got blue eyes or they've got something that makes them different, and therefore they are inferior in some way, without accepting that everybody has something that they can contribute to society. A very tiny amount of people. The textbooks tell us about 3% of men and about 1% of women are psychopaths. They are utterly selfish. Whether we can do anything about that, the jury's still out. But it's only a tiny amount of people are utterly selfish. Most people are a bit selfish, and a tiny amount of people are not selfish enough, probably, the so-called empathetic people, But influence acts upon people to bring them to feel themselves superior, better than other people, and it's just wrong. just fundamentally wrong and very dangerous, as we are finding out in a
Mm-hmm.
war in a world that's still full of warfare.
Yes, it can be very scary when you've got these kinds of people in power too. I wanted to ask you, so I've heard the term personal autonomy. That can you talk to me a little bit about that? What does that mean to you for someone to have personal autonomy?
It's the freedom to make your own decisions and the freedom to have your own emotions. I'm particularly concerned about emotional autonomy. I said before, there's social intelligence. That's how we relate to other people. And elitist, totalist, authoritarian groups they make barriers between people so that communicating with others, often when people, here he comes, often when people leave a closed group, they find it extraordinarily difficult to communicate with other people. So having social intelligence and so develop social skills is really important. That is a part of autonomy. Being able to reason and think things through, that is a part of autonomy. But at the center of autonomy is whether your emotions are being controlled. Because if your emotions are being controlled, you aren't free. If somebody can make you feel something, whether it's shame or rage or terror, if they can make you feel something, you're not autonomous. And I think that anybody who's involved in therapy or counseling should have as the goal to give autonomy to the person who's come to them. And I fear that that is often not the case, that there are all too many therapists and counselors who love the idea of being in control of a relationship and instructing a person what they ought to believe, and how they ought to behave. For me, working with the people we have at Open Minds and through the new Educare program, it's very much, what are your goals? What are your objectives? What do you want to achieve in life? How do you want to relate to other people? That's your autonomy.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting what you said about emotions, because emotions is what's going to motivate you to act. I mean, if somebody, for example, is emotionally involved with somebody, like let's take a couple, a husband and wife, and then the wife starts chatting with somebody online, and what happens is, if she becomes emotionally involved with him, that can become a motivating factor to say, hey, I like this guy more than my husband and let's move out with this guy now. It's because of the being emotionally involved with him. And I think, and so that becomes a seat, how do you describe it? Your motivating factor to do something in life. And if you can get someone to be fearful or feel guilty, they may do things that they normally would not have normally done.
Absolutely. I mean, if you take food away from people for 4 or 5 days, it's astonishing what you can get them to do. I think it's also important to understand that we're all motivated by the sense of infatuation. We're all motivated by falling in love, not just with people, but with things. We love novelty. We love new things. And we can really get, too taken up. We live in a consumer culture, which is a very modern idea. It's something that came about in the 1920s and 30s. This idea of a society that will run on buying stuff. And it means you can't keep trotting out the same black Ford Model T. You've got to make all these new things. And we're pretty much destroying the world as a consequence of this, but we're enjoying doing it. So it's all good,
And people are getting rich off of it as well, of course.
Yeah, and the horror is that the people who are getting rich off it are not fulfilled, not satisfied, and they want to get richer and they want to have more power rather than, and they can have a kind of philanthropic turn. So that, say, Andrew Carnegie, who's now remembered as a great philanthropist, when you look at how he made his money and the thousands of people, there's a balance. But he decided in the end to endow some libraries, so it's all fine. But we want to be in love. We want to fall in love. And So we have that tendency. People will join groups because somebody comes along and flatters them and makes them feel good about themselves and is very charming and all of this. I mean, the worst of one of the worst of the groups, the so-called Children of God, the Family of Love, had a technique which they call flirty fishing. This group still exists, in a minority, thankfully, but they are notorious for their sexual abuse of children from the age of 3 upwards. But they would actually, and I knew a guy who did this, they would actually take the women within the group and send them out on the streets to recruit men through prostitution. And I have a friend who spent a few months in this group, and he was persuading women into doing this. And so they will use the attractiveness of a human being to lure recruits in. Curiously, you'll find the same thing in many, many groups, not quite necessarily to that horrible extreme, but where you're being lured, you're being brought on and sold this idea. I mean, another version of it is that, you know, when I get some email from some beautiful young woman who's saying, you know, how much she's read my profile online, and you know, the first email will be this picture of this stunning and gorgeous woman, and you know that it's actually coming from some 75-year-old Ukrainian or something, you know, and then the next thing will be, oh, I'm stuck and I need some money, and you know, but the idea that maybe somebody loves you, maybe somebody has this thing to give to you, that we are very susceptible emotionally. Yeah. And a part of emotional autonomy is where you can sit back and go, no, relationships are things that develop. You know, it's great feeling euphoric and all of that. But what's really important in life is to have excellent relationships with other people, you know, and to be able to deal with the problems that come along and get past the upsets of life, and have a stable network of people so that when tragedy occurs, and it will occur, you'll have somewhere to go and people who'll look out for you because you have a true and developed loving relationship, rather than, you know, the next person in line, the kind of sort of, you know, that sort of forever falling in love, which we see as cult hopping, where somebody leaves one group and they then jump into another one.
And it's stuck on the infatuation or something. They can't get past that. They love that feeling of maybe the love bombing or whatever it is, and the excitement at the beginning, just like people have that at the beginning of a relationship. But then after it develops and they begin to see, oh, this person's not perfect after all, and the rose-colored glasses fall off, they realize, well, that girl looks nice, so what about her?
And on to the next one. And it's like an addiction, a craving for a drug, getting this thing, and realizing, you know, they say there's no fool like an old fool, talking about, you know, people who, my sort of age probably, who fall head over heels in love with somebody, and you know, then that, now the feelings are good. The feelings, you know, there's nothing wrong with having great feelings. The problem is that they're very, very easy to manipulate. And so understanding that, you know, we like to eat chocolate is a good thing, and chocolate's probably good for us, but it comes with a substance called sugar, and that's not good for us at all. And people will, it also contains various drugs, which including actually the active ingredient in cannabis, that's in chocolate. So yes, the Delta 9.
And I've had a cannabis chocolate, so I was doubling down there.
But there are things that make us feel good, and we want to feel good. And coming back to the idea of emotional autonomy, understanding that as well as possible. And it's okay, it's fine to desire things, it's fine to enjoy things, but be careful that you don't sort of fall over the cliff trying to pick the strawberry, you know?
And I like that advice, because it almost makes it sound like we're just, you know, old fuddy-duddies. We're just going to be skeptical of everybody and negative on everybody. Whenever we're presented with something, the first choice is to be negative and down on it. And I prefer to have exactly what you just said. Be careful. It's yes, you know, they say if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. But there's something to be said for just taking a step back and being, okay, this sounds wonderful, but let's read the fine print. Let's be careful, because we don't want to be taken advantage of or find ourselves coerced into doing something that we never imagined, to have to do.
Yeah, and often that involvement, there are baby steps, that the involvement is so slow that you don't realize what's happened. I talked with many years ago with a forensic psychologist, and he would interview white collar criminals, and he'd say it always seems to be the same story. They'll come along and say, well, the boss came in and he said, would you backdate this contract to yesterday? And that's simple enough. And that's the first step, that from there it'll be downhill on a steeper and steeper decline. And they go, I don't know what happened to my life. I don't know how I came to embezzle $7 million. There has to be a certain caution there. We talk at Open Minds about healthy skepticism to differentiate it from cynicism, which is having a jaded and negative view of everything.
Okay.
Which, obviously on some days we all feel that way a little bit, but if we're to be normal and human. But the healthy skepticism is where you're saying, well, exactly as you say, that sounds too good to be true. When somebody comes up to you on the street and says, hey, we're going to give you a free personality test. And you sit down and find that you're answering 200 very personal questions that they're putting in a file. It wasn't free. There is something, there's no such thing as a free lunch.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as a free personality test either. We have to look at what's being offered to us and who's offering it. And a big piece of advice is take your time, walk away, talk to friends, and sleep on it. Think about it. Never sign a contract on the day it's offered.
Yeah, sleep on it, I think, is the best advice. I wish I had that when I was younger. And I guess that's why I'm probably already know the answer to this, but I just wanted to emphasize that the Open Minds Foundation is focusing more on people around the age of like 5 to 25, people in my age group.
Yes, exactly. People in our age group, yes.
Oh, our age group, okay.
Certainly my mental age group is more like 5, and my emotional age group, yeah.
So is there any quick answer as to why you would say that this is the case?
Yeah, the developmental stage is the most important. Assertiveness and the right to assert yourself to very young children, to be able to say, this is how I feel, this is what I think. As Arachelef says, to give them intelligent disobedience, to say, that doesn't sound right. And so they know they have the right to question things. So with younger children, it's that. Not bullying them, bossing them around, forcing them to do things. But of course, also not letting them run rampant. There have to be boundaries and, things are set. But assertiveness is a key word here. Yeah. When we enter puberty, we get hormone release, which brings on infatuation. It makes us able to feel this fantastic, transcendent feeling about the world, which, sadly, as we go through our 20s and become jaded and cynical, may sort of...
Because we've been burned.
Yeah. And I think, but there's just an internal chemistry in human beings that, I feel glad because I have what my mother called the gift of joy, that I do appreciate life and people and nature and art and all of these things. I know that many people didn't have that in their childhood. They don't perhaps have it in their genes. So, I'm incredibly lucky, but it also means that as a teenager, I could, have an experience of euphoria that would last for weeks. I could get happy about life without having any cannabis chocolate. I could get happy about life, and I became susceptible at that time. Now, there's an idea that comes from a wonderful psychologist called Judith Rich Harris, and who wrote a couple of really fine books. And she said, well, the reality is, and she looked at literally thousands of psychological studies. She's out on her own, a maverick, not belonging to any school. And she said, the reality is, the first book was called The Nurture Assumption, that your views of the world, your culture views, that will stay with you for the rest of your life form when you're somewhere around 13 years old. And you know, at this point where your infatuation comes in, you know, with me it was imagining no possessions and watching a bloke playing a $70,000 piano singing about it. You know, that I didn't quite understand how expensive the piano was, but you know, John Lennon and all of that, when I was 13, that's what was happening. We were imagining no possessions. And I did, and it's like, well, that'd be a rather boring world, wouldn't it? You know, if I didn't have anything at all. I mean, how would, you know, if I didn't have this glass, I could, you know, no, let's not get too silly here. Great place to go. That we will carry that forward to the extent that if you're unfortunate enough to get Alzheimer's, then if somebody plays the music that you listened to when you were 13 or 14, you will still be able to get up and dance. It's been long observed that even in forms of dementia, that we take in early adolescence remains with us. So often our ideals, the problem in Judith Rich Harris's assertion is that this doesn't come from your mom and dad, and it doesn't come from your teachers. It comes from your peer group. So, you know, if you, like me, knew a lot of people who are listening to the Beatles, then and the Rolling Stones, thankfully, and the Who, and all of Jimi Hendrix and all of that good stuff, Pink Floyd, let's get it all in there. I saw King Crimson last year. They were fantastic.
Oh,
it's
yeah,
the best thing I've ever seen in my life.
Wow,
About 3 months
cool.
ago. 8-piece band, fantastic. But you know, go and see them if you can. But if you grew up in that kind of peace and love sort of era, then they're going to be your core values. And if you grow up now listening to grime, or you know, I'm hip. I know the 1950s
Grunge.
word.
Is it grunge?
No, grunge was the early 90s.
Oh, is it grime?
Grime is happening right
really?
now.
Okay, I'm clearly out of sorts with everything. I don't know.
But I have two teenagers who neither of them actually listened to grime music. In fact, they actually came to King Crimson and loved it. But
Okay.
kids these days, they're so old-fashioned. That the message that is coming to you through, you know, Eric Theodore Cartman, or you know, Rick and Morty at the moment are very popular. That is going to stay with you. So getting to people at that age and hopefully getting them to them through their own culture. You know, I can put these ideas out there. This guy contacted me, and he'd heard that I'd drafted some ideas for some documentaries, and I was telling you about something I did in 1991, and he said, oh, my agent might be able to help you with that. And it's like, well, that was 1991. That's not my particular interest at the moment, but thank you so much. I said, what do you do? He said, I write scripts for zombie movies. And I said, you're the guy I need. You know, this is where these ideas need to go, that if they're to get into the culture, then it's people like him. It's people, you know, like Stan Lee, or the late Stan Lee, as he knows. They're the people who actually put ideas into a culture. You know, how did we know that we were meant to put our underpants on over our trousers before Superman came along? We take in the culture around us, and whatever influences, you know, when we had gangster rap in with Snoop Doggy Dogg, or however many dogs he had in his name originally, and Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls and P. Diddy and all of these wonderful people who actually, Cypress Hill, who actually I personally think produced Eminem. They produced some really remarkable stuff. In fact, going back to Run DMC and all that, I'm naming all of these people not from the point of view of I listened to this and loved it, but from the point of view I heard this and respected it. But the culture that it was talking about, when you dug underneath it, was a culture of complete alienation, you know, caused within the social system, not, you know, the problem of, not caused by Tupac Shakur, who was actually a middle-class kid who grew up in a nice household. But they're talking about, you know, their hoes and their bitches and their this utterly disrespectful way of looking at life. That spread into a generation. And if you're going to change it, you have to change how that generation feels. And I would say that if you gave them intelligent disobedience from the age of 4 or 5, and allowed them to have a voice, you know, because that alienation is, we're not being listened to. And so they then, you know, you have this bizarre idea of, a friend of mine was telling me that she saw this young man being arrested, and this was in the States, and he was walked across the car park by these two policemen. Now, he was a white guy who was impersonating black guys, and of course there's this convention of having trousers, jeans that don't fit, and they'd taken his belt away from him.
Oh no.
So she watched as they walked in and his trousers fell down. But this notion that, you know, the reason you don't have the belt, you don't have the shoelaces, is because that's what happens when they put you in jail. So you had kids impersonating a culture that is an imprisoned culture.
Interesting. I never thought about it, but you're right. That's what they were doing.
Yeah, and it's a way of rebelling, just as punk was a way of rebelling, and that rebellion's fine. The horror of it, of course, with punk is it's manufactured. You know, that Malcolm McLaren went, I know a way of making a load of money. I'm going to call this band the Sex Pistols.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. And then later admitted it all. It was, you know, they went to EMI where they got a record contract and they destroyed the offices so that EMI turned around and said, keep the money and go away. You know, £100,000 in that day. Yeah. So, but it's the idea of manufactured culture. The important thing, and I've rambled, the important thing is that to get to people at that age and to help them to think critically, to have healthy skepticism, to look for having emotional autonomy and to developing social skills, that's the point when it's going to be most important, because after that, once you get past the age of 25, you're usually going to be rescuing them from the damage that happened.
Right. Yeah, and then it's too late at that point. Well, not too late, but now you've had all these problems that could have been avoided.
Yeah, and I gave a talk in Riga in Latvia, and I'd recommend Riga. It's a beautiful place. I'd never have thought it, you know, the Soviet Empire, you know, but you know, they escaped all of that. Really lovely place, lovely people. But I gave a talk where they called the talk an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and I had to then translate that because it was a European audience. So it's 28 grams of prevention is worth 454 grams of cure.
Ah, okay.
And it's worth actually a ton of cure. That the time it takes to help somebody come back is years. I today was talking with somebody in the counter-terrorist world who wants to commission me to do a 4-minute statement about human predators and the way they prey on people. And those 4 minutes can actually protect somebody for a lifetime. Those things that you and I were not told when we were kids, that were not in our schooling. Finding out how people recruit, how they seduce others, how undue influence and manipulation and coercive control works. You know, and the little techniques like gaslighting, where somebody makes you unsure of your own reality, your own decisions, even your own sanity. These techniques are very easy to understand, and they're hidden from our education system. In fact, in some places, I fear to say, again, Ira Chalef in Intelligent Disobedience, he got hold of a couple of teachers' manuals in the US showing how manipulation is to be used, how teachers are being trained in psychologically manipulating their pupils, not to be disruptive, you know, to sit down and do as they're told, rather than helping them to overcome whatever problems they have and develop social skills. So, you know, we're in those areas. Mike, this has been a wide-ranging conversation, hasn't it? As usual.
Well, I think it is. But what you just said there, I find so interesting, because children, at least, you know, when I was in school, we were taught, you know, be quiet, be obedient, do what you're told. And I don't disagree with, I mean, you have to have some rules, as you stated earlier in our conversation today. You have to have some boundaries, I think is what you called it. But unfortunately, you're also training them to be very susceptible to a predator. Don't ask any questions. Don't question authority. And I think what's really interesting about why you're focusing on children and the younger people is because they've been taught that adults tell the truth. You know, you listen to your parents, listen to teachers, listen to policemen. So basically they're conditioned to believe that when an adult says something, it's the truth. But you and I both know that there are some adults that are not good people, that do not tell the truth, that manipulate other people to do the things that, you know, are very bad. And that's what children need to be taught as well. And I think that's why it's so key that you are focusing in on younger people, so that they get to realize what you and I already know, but now at a much younger age, so that they don't have to make the mistakes that you made.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you that the point is also this notion that adults are infallible. Adults, you know, understand now that there's a move that's been a surge that's been going through the educational world for the last 30 or 40 years. There's a guy called Matthew Lipman was at the center of it, which is basically saying the old school says, I know everything, I'm going to tell you the truth about what happens. The new school says we don't know everything. We are parts of a community of learning, and I've spent more time looking at it than you have, but you may well have insights that I haven't had. And so it makes us all, you know, part of a community of learning, of where our social skills become important, and teaching children teaching them that they absolutely have the right to express themselves, and not in some kind of fixed sort of, how did that make you feel sort of situation. But opening up communication and making people more communicative, and welcoming other people's communication, and hearing people out, you know, whatever it is they have to say.
It really reminds me of toys, when they're manufacturing toys, and they never really got the input of children. And so when they actually brought in the children to play with the toys, they had fresh eyes, and they realized, oh, you know, they learned so much from what the children had to say about these toys. You know, so it's not just the adult saying, I think children are going to want this, so we're going to make this toy. Well, when they actually spoke to the children, they got some fascinating feedback that, you know, was able to actually sell these toys.
Absolutely. Have you heard the story of what Mrs. Mattel said when she saw the first Ken doll?
No, I'd love to hear this.
Well, Barbie came along, and then they made Ken, and Mrs. Mattel said, why doesn't he have any genitals?
Why did I think you were going to say that? That's why I said I'd love to hear you.
What are we teaching our children? I mean, the funny thing is, when I was 14, I went on a school trip to Norway, and I found a Norwegian troll who was like this character about this big. Sadly, we've lost now. He had genitals. The Norwegians don't have any problem with that. You know, that's okay. but yeah, sorry, it's just a silly story. But yes, that involving children in their own education, so that there's now a concept called flipping, where rather than having the lesson and then watching a video, the kids watch the video, and then the teacher's job is to find out which kids understood and which didn't. And they then partner up the ones that understood with the ones that didn't. And they found that kids who've just worked out how something happens are much better at explaining it to those who don't than teachers who spent years. We become lost in our own expertise.
Yeah.
You know? And what a way of creating a community that, one of my boys, he's really stupidly good at maths. And so he would go into the lesson, finish his work, and then the kid next to him would need help, and he'd help him. And what developed over a period of some months was that other children would start helping other children. And you go, well, the poor teacher who sat there with 30 of these horrors to deal with becomes a facilitator. And instead of them all, you know, flicking little bits of paper at him when he's not looking, there starts to be an enterprise of acquiring information rather than these are the answers to the SATs and you've got to memorize them. You get the idea that you're being educated to find something out, to learn something, because contrary to what most school children have been led to believe, curiosity is a wonderful thing, and the world is just unbelievably fascinating. It's not a place where, you know this thing that they deliberately turn up the temperature in classrooms to make kids drowsy, to make them more susceptible to information in some places.
Really?
Oh, come on.
Oh, okay.
And yet the most successful education systems, if you look to the Scandinavians, who frequently win the literacy tables, they don't start teaching children to read and write till they're 7. And they spend half of the day, every school day in Finland, which is a pretty cold place for a while, in Sweden, in Norway and Denmark, half of the school day is spent outdoors. So
playing?
I mean, unlike
playing or learning or
learning, that the classroom goes outside, and it becomes part of the, their environment. We've had this report last month that 90% of Japanese school children are now short-sighted, and the theory at the moment is that they spend too much time indoors. They don't have enough lumens in their lives for their eyes to develop properly, and there are kids going blind. So the Scandinavians have got past that, but they've also created a different learning environment, and a different way of relating. Being at school should be, and there are schools where this happens, where kids actually go in early, they stay late, they spend the weekends there, not because anybody's forcing them to, but because it's a great place to be. And Ken Robinson's work on this, his The Elements or Creative Schools, there's good work on it. That's where we should be going, a society that's fun, a society that's engaging, rather than a standardized society that puts out sausages that are all the same, size and type. And that leads to autonomy. That leads to compassion towards others. That leads to humility about ourselves, with the understanding that we don't have to be the elite. We can actually make mistakes, and we won't be pounced upon. That we can live fruitful and productive lives in community with others, where the bullies, the people are kind of telling us off and forcing us down, can be the ones that have to sit in the naughty corner until they feel calmer about it, and can come and play nicely with the rest of us. And on a global scale, that's a statement of our mission at Open Minds, to get people to play nicely. Let's put it that way.
Well, I like that. I think maybe we could end with that, because I think you and I, we've chatted before, and there's so much to say, and we could go on forever.
And we probably will.
But I really appreciated your insights there on undue influence, on personal autonomy, and different age groups that you're dealing with, and why you're trying to help these ones, and different ways that you can do this. So thank you so much for talking.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I very much appreciate that. So let's hope we can chat again soon.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, take care of yourself then.
Yeah, you too. Lovely talking with you.